Iran has opened fire on an Indian oil tanker in the Strait of Hormuz.
We are taking fire. Repeat, we are taking fire. Requesting immediate turn back. Over.
Even after a fragile US-Iran ceasefire, the United States wants NATO to stand with it and enforce a naval blockade in one of the world's most critical oil routes. But NATO says no. And just like that, this isn't just a US-Iran conflict anymore. But now, this is also about NATO's future.
Welcome to Global Power Game.
For decades, NATO was the most powerful military alliance on Earth, not because of its weapon, but because of its unshakable unity. But in 2026 US-Israel war in Iran, that unity was truly tested. Because for the first time in decades, NATO did not fail in war, but it failed in unity. And that forced a bigger question. A question of, does NATO even serve the same purpose anymore? The foundation of NATO goes back to 1949, a world still recovering from the devastation of the World War II, but already and quickly slipping into a new kind of a conflict, the Cold War. This wasn't a war fought directly between the United States and the Soviet Union. But make no mistake, because it was still a war. A war that was fought in the shadows through proxies, through influence, and through the fear. From Korea to Vietnam, bullets were fired, nations were torn apart. Just not between the two superpowers, but their proxies nations. Further as tension escalated between the United States and the Soviet Union, the world stood on the edge once again, holding its breath for a war that could possibly end everything. In the uncertainty of Cold War, the alliance of NATO was born, an alliance between the United States and its European allies, an alliance built to counter the rise of the Soviet Union under a one simple promise, which was attack one and you attack all. NATO's Article 5, attack one, attack all, has only been used once in history. And interestingly, it wasn't for Europe, rather, it was after 9/11 to defend the United States. But today, the biggest threats are just no longer military, rather, they are economic, technological, and regional. And that creates a problem, because US sees NATO as a tool for global power projection, while Europe sees NATO as a shield, not a sword. For decades, this alliance kept a global balance from the Cold War to modern conflicts. The United States led and Europe followed. But today, that equation is breaking. In early March 2026, one strike changed the Middle East equation. The United States and Israel hit Iran harder. Not a warning, not a message, a decapitation strike. And within hours, Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei was eliminated. Next, what followed was a chain reaction, because Iran retaliated by unleashing missile strikes across the Middle East, hitting US air bases, and suddenly one narrow passage, the Strait of Hormuz, held the world's oil supply hostage. And then, fuel prices surged, markets panicked, and the world felt the shock. And then the pressure began. President Donald Trump pushed European and NATO allies to join the conflict against Iran. The expectation was clear, that the NATO alliance would stand together with the United States. But then came the shock. NATO did not unite. In fact, several European nations refused to join the war. Some did not even support it politically. Well, here is the reality of why NATO allies did not join the United States in the Iran war. And the reality is, beneath the surface, Europe wasn't just avoiding the war against Iran, but it is actually protecting its own economy against the unwanted economic damage from the warfare. Because unlike the US, Europe is far more dependent on the Middle Eastern energy routes and far more vulnerable to the supply shocks. Nearly 20% of global oil and LNG supply flows through the Strait of Hormuz, and any escalation there directly threatens European economies through rising energy cost, inflation, and industrial slowdown. Besides, there is also another layer to this. For most European countries, Israel is not a formal treaty ally in the way it is for the United States, which means this was never seen as Europeans' war to fight. Europe maintained a well calculated strategic distance from the Middle Eastern war to avoid being pulled into a conflict that could damage their economy without even directly serving their security interest. European countries believe that NATO was designed for defense, not for wars like Iran. NATO should protect its own territory and not fight external wars. On the contrary, the US believes that NATO should support US global military actions. These are two completely different visions of the same alliance. Can the United States actually pull out of NATO? The answer to this question is far more complicated than it sounds. In December 2023, under Joe Biden, the US passed a law that directly blocks any US president from exiting NATO on their own. This wasn't just a routine policy change, rather, it was a preemptive move. Because lawmakers in Washington feared that if Donald Trump returned to power, he could possibly try to pull the United States out of NATO. And the law says the president cannot withdraw from NATO unless Congress passes a law approving it or 2/3 of the Senate votes in its favor. That's a massive barrier, because in US politics, getting that level of agreement is extremely rare. And right now, Donald Trump doesn't even have solid congressional backing to make that happen. And because of that, it's highly unlikely that the United States will be able to pull out of NATO anytime soon. So for now, NATO isn't breaking, but it's no longer fully aligned either, as we are already seeing it in the Strait of Hormuz. For the first time in decades, Europe is preparing for a future that is less dependent on Washington and more dependent on its own spending capability and autonomy. That's not replacing NATO, but rebalancing it. And that is why NATO isn't collapsing, but it is actually transforming into an alliance that is more European, more transactional, and less unified in the hands of United States. Even now, diplomacy is still in motion between the United States and NATO. A day after the ceasefire, Donald Trump met Mark Rutte to push the NATO allies and securing the Strait of Hormuz. But NATO refused to join a direct blockade in the Strait of Hormuz and avoid conflict with Iran. Instead, there is a separate coalition led by the United Kingdom and France trying to open the Strait of Hormuz through the diplomacy. Now look at the contrast. While the United States applies pressure, Europe pushes for diplomacy. Same alliance, but different priorities. And that reveals the real shift. Today, NATO isn't divided by the weakness, but it is actually divided by the lack of a common purpose between the United States and NATO. And from here, everything depends on one factor: the US leadership. Whether it can bring NATO back to a common purpose, because that may decide not just NATO's future, but the future of the entire Western Alliance. And that's where things stand today. Thanks for your time, guys. I really appreciate it. And if you want to understand how power really shapes the world through geopolitics, business, and the global economy, please make sure you subscribe to Global Power Game. Cheers, have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one.